The bus ride took almost 3 hours, but she didn't mind. She had been waiting for this day for months. Her fingers tapped nervously against her white cane as the vehicle bumped along the highway. She could hear other passengers talking, some listening to music, others scrolling through their phones. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was already at the grand concert hall, imagining the moment she'd been dreaming about since she first heard about the master class. Her name was Lynn, and she was 17 years old. She had been blind since she was 4. After a sudden illness took her sight almost overnight. But what the illness took from her eyes, it seemed to give back to her ears. Music became her world, not just something she listened to, but something she lived and breathed. The piano became her voice, her way of seeing the world that others saw with their eyes. When the bus finally pulled into the station, her mother squeezed her hand. "Are you nervous?" her mother asked softly. "A little," Lynn admitted, but mostly excited. Her mother had taken the day off work to bring her here. Money was tight and the bus tickets weren't cheap. But when Lynn had shown her the announcement about Victor Romano's masterclass, her mother hadn't hesitated. "If this is your dream," she had said, "then we'll find a way. Victor Romano." Even his name sounded important. He was one of the most famous pianists in the world. He had played in the greatest concert halls across Europe and America. He had won awards that most musicians could only dream of. And now, for one day only, he was holding a masterclass in their city. Young pianists from all over the region had applied for a chance to learn from him. Lynn hadn't been selected as one of the official students. Those spots had gone to kids from prestigious music schools, students who had fancy teachers and expensive training. But the masterclass was open to observers, and Lynn had convinced her mother to let her go just to watch. Maybe, just maybe, she'd get a chance to meet him, to tell him about her music, to show him what she could do. The concert hall was even more impressive than she'd imagined. She could tell from the echo of footsteps on marble floors, the high ceilings that made every sound float upward. Her mother described it to her in whispers as they walked through the lobby. Crystal chandeliers, red velvet curtains, gold trim on the walls. It was the kind of place where important things happened. The reception area was crowded with young pianists and their parents. Everyone was dressed nicely. She could hear the rustle of expensive clothes, smell different perfumes mixing in the air. People were talking in excited voices, comparing notes about their training, their teachers, their achievements. Lynn and her mother found chairs near the wall. Her white cane folded neatly beside her, Lynn sat quietly and listened. She heard a girl nearby bragging about performing at a music festival in Vienna. A boy was telling his father about the Steinway piano his school had just purchased. Everyone seemed so confident, so accomplished. "Maybe this was a mistake," Lynn whispered to her mother. "I don't belong here." Her mother put an arm around her shoulders. "You belong anywhere music is. Don't forget that." Then the room suddenly got quieter. Lynn could feel the energy shift, like everyone had turned to look at the same thing. She heard footsteps, confident and quick, moving through the crowd. "That's him," someone whispered loudly. "That's Victor Romano." Lynn's heart started beating faster. He was here. The man she had listened to on recordings hundreds of times. The pianist whose performances had made her cry, had made her want to be better, to play with that same passion and skill. People started lining up, and Lynn's mother gently guided her to join them. "This is your chance," her mother said. "Go talk to him." The line moved slowly. Lynn could hear Victor speaking to each student, his voice deep and accented. He sounded friendly but also important, like someone who knew his time was valuable. She heard him laugh at something someone said, heard him compliment a girl on her dress. Then it was her turn. Lynn stepped forward, her cane in her left hand. She had practiced what she wanted to say 100 times on the bus ride. "Mr. Romano," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Lynn Chen. I've been playing piano since I was 5 years old. I've memorized over 50 pieces. Chopin, Beethoven, Debussy. I came here today because your music has inspired me more than anything else in my life." There was a pause. She waited for his response, hoping he could hear the passion in her voice, the dedication she had for music. "That's nice, dear," he said, but his voice sounded distant, distracted. She could tell he was already looking past her, probably at the next person in line. "But this masterclass is quite advanced. The pieces we'll be working on are very complex. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable just observing from the back of the room." Lynn felt like she'd been slapped. She had expected questions maybe, or curiosity. She had expected people to doubt her because of her blindness before, that was nothing new. But she hadn't expected to be dismissed so completely, so quickly, like she wasn't even worth a conversation. "I understand complex pieces," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "I can play them. I just wanted a chance to—" "That's wonderful," he interrupted, and she could hear him already turning away. "Enjoy the masterclass. Next, please." Her mother found her a moment later, standing frozen in the same spot.
"What happened?"
her mother asked. "He didn't even listen," Lynn said quietly. He didn't even give me a chance." They made their way to seats at the very back of the auditorium. Lynn could hear other students whispering as she passed, could feel their eyes on her. She knew what they were thinking. What was a blind girl doing at a piano masterclass? How could she possibly play if she couldn't even see the keys? As she sat down in the back row, her cane folded beside her, Lynn felt tears burning behind her eyes. But she wouldn't cry, not here. Not in front of all these people who already thought she didn't belong. Her mother squeezed her hand. "We can leave if you want," she whispered. Lynn shook her head. "No, I came here to learn from him. Even if he won't teach me directly, I can still listen. I can still learn." But inside her heart was breaking. She had traveled 3 hours for 30 seconds of conversation. She had spent months looking forward to this day, and it was over before it had even really begun. The masterclass was about to start. Students were taking their seats, programs rustling, voices settling into expectant silence. Victor Romano was somewhere at the front of the room, probably sitting at the beautiful grand piano she could only imagine. Lynn sat in the darkness that was always her world, listening to everything around her, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in coming here. Maybe her mother had been wrong. Maybe she didn't belong anywhere music was. Maybe there were some dreams that were just too big for a blind girl from a small town to reach. The masterclass began, and Lynn listened, trying to focus on the music, and not on the hollow feeling in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but this day that had started with such crushing disappointment was about to become the most important day of her life. The first student to play was a girl named Alexandra. Lynn could hear her walking confidently to the piano, her heels clicking against the wooden stage floor. There was no hesitation in her steps. This was someone who had performed many times before. Alexandra played a Chopin waltz. It was technically perfect, every note in exactly the right place, the tempo steady and controlled. When she finished, Victor applauded and offered some suggestions about phrasing and dynamics. His voice was warm when he spoke to her, encouraging. Lynn noticed the difference immediately. This was how he talked to students he thought were worth his time. One by one, students went up to play. A boy performed Liszt, his hands flying across the keys with impressive speed. A girl tackled Rachmaninoff, though she stumbled through some of the harder passages. Each time, Victor listened carefully and gave detailed feedback. He was tough but fair, pointing out mistakes but also highlighting what they did well. Lynn listened to everything. She absorbed every note, every comment Victor made. Even from the back row, even after being dismissed, she was determined to learn something from this day. Her mother had given up a day's pay to bring her here. She wouldn't let that go to waste. 2 hours into the master class, a young man walked onto the stage. Lynn heard Victor's voice brighten with recognition. "Ah, Daniel," Victor said warmly. "I've been looking forward to hearing you play. Ladies and gentlemen, this young man has studied at the Moscow Conservatory and the Juilliard School. He's one of the most promising pianists of his generation." Lynn heard the audience murmur with interest. This was clearly someone special, someone Victor respected. "I'll be playing the third movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata," Daniel announced. His voice was confident, almost cocky. Lynn sat up straighter. She knew this piece intimately. It was one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written, full of racing notes and complex passages that required incredible technical skill. But more than that, it was deeply emotional. Beethoven had written it during a time of great personal struggle, when he was losing his hearing. The music was full of anger, fear, and desperate hope. Daniel began to play. Right away, Lynn could tell something was wrong. Not with his technique, that was flawless. His fingers hit every note perfectly. The tempo was exactly right, the dynamics were textbook correct. But something essential was missing. He was playing the notes, but he wasn't playing the music. Lynn could hear it clearly. Where there should have been anguish, there was only precision. Where Beethoven had poured his heart onto the page, Daniel was simply executing instructions. It was like watching someone read a poem without understanding what the words meant. About halfway through, Daniel faltered. His hands stumbled over a particularly difficult passage. He tried to recover, but the mistake had thrown him off. He pushed through to the end, but by the time he finished, everyone in the room could tell something had gone wrong. The applause was polite, but subdued. Lynn heard Daniel's footsteps leave the piano, slower and less confident than when he'd approached it. Victor was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had an edge to it. "Daniel, you have studied with the best teachers in the world. Your technique is exceptional, but today I heard nothing. Just notes on a page. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I think so," Daniel replied, though he sounded uncertain. "This piece," Victor continued, his voice rising with passion, "is one of the most profound works ever written. Beethoven was going deaf when he composed this." Can you imagine? A composer, losing the very sense that defined his existence. This movement is his rage, his fear, his refusal to surrender to fate. And what did I hear from you? Nothing. No emotion. No understanding. You played it like a technical exercise. The room was completely silent now. Lynn could feel the tension in the air. Students were afraid to breathe too loudly. Victor's voice grew louder, more theatrical. Does anyone here truly understand what Beethoven was expressing? Does anyone feel this music instead of just playing it? No one responded. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy. Lynn imagined all those talented students sitting frozen in their seats, terrified of volunteering after watching Daniel fail so publicly. Her heart was pounding. She knew this piece. She had played it hundreds of times in her small apartment, in the practice room at her local community center. She had felt every note of it, because she understood what it was like to lose something essential, to have the world tell you that you were limited, that you couldn't do what others could do. Before she could think about it too much, before fear could stop her, Lynn raised her hand. "I do," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. But in the silent room, everyone heard it. She heard people turning in their seats, trying to see who had spoken. She heard whispers starting. "Who said that?" Victor asked. Lynn stood up. "I did, I understand the piece. I'd like to try playing it if you'll let me." More whispers now, louder. She heard someone nearby say, "That's the blind girl from earlier." Someone else laughed softly, not quite cruel, but definitely skeptical. "You?" Victor said. She could hear the doubt in his voice. "The girl from the lobby?" "Yes, sir." There was a pause. Lynn imagined Victor looking at her, trying to decide what to do. She had embarrassed him by speaking up after he'd dismissed her. He could refuse her easily, tell her to sit down, to stop wasting everyone's time. Her mother grabbed her hand, squeezing tight. Lynn didn't know if it was encouragement or a plea to sit back down. "This is one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire," Victor said slowly. "It has humbled pianists far more experienced than you. Are you certain you want to attempt it? Here, in front of everyone?" Lynn's hands were shaking. Her legs felt weak. Every instinct told her to sit down, to not risk the humiliation of failing in front of all these people. But something stronger pushed her forward. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was anger at being dismissed so casually. Maybe it was simply that she loved this piece too much to let this moment pass. "I'm certain," she said. She heard Victor sigh. "Fine," he said, and she couldn't tell if he was annoyed or amused. "Come up here. Let's see what you can do. But I warn you, this piece has broken stronger pianists than you." Lynn made her way down the aisle, her cane tapping in front of her. The walk to the stage felt like miles. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could hear people whispering, wondering what was about to happen. Some were curious. Others thought this would be a disaster. Her mother called out softly, "I believe in you, sweetheart." Lynn found the steps to the stage, climbed them carefully. Someone, probably an assistant, guided her to the piano bench. She sat down, her hands trembling as they found the keys. The piano was beautiful. She could tell from the first touch. The keys were perfectly weighted, responsive. This was an instrument made for serious musicians. Behind her, she heard Victor settling into his chair, heard the audience shifting, getting comfortable, waiting to see if the blind girl would crash and burn, or if maybe, just maybe, something interesting was about to happen. Lynn took a deep breath. She closed her eyes, though it made no difference. She let her fingers rest on the keys, feeling their coolness, their smoothness. She thought about Beethoven, about losing something precious, about refusing to give up even when the world tells you you're finished. Then she began to play. The first notes came softly, almost like a whisper. Lynn's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that surprised everyone watching. This wasn't how the piece usually started. Most pianists attacked it aggressively, showing off their technical skill from the very first measure. But Lynn began differently. She let the opening breathe, let it build slowly. In the audience, people leaned forward. The whispers stopped. Something about the way she played commanded attention immediately. Then the music began to grow. The notes came faster, building in intensity. Lynn's hands started to move more quickly across the keyboard, but there was no panic in her playing, no sense of rushing. Every note was deliberate, purposeful. She wasn't just hitting keys. She was telling a story. Her mother sat in the back row with tears already forming in her eyes. She had heard Lynn practice this piece at home countless times. But this was different. This was her daughter pouring everything she had into the music, holding nothing back. Victor sat motionless in his chair on the side of the stage. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. But his eyes never left Lynn's hands. The piece exploded into its famous rapid passages, the ones that had tripped up Daniel just minutes before. Notes cascaded like a waterfall, fast and furious. Lynn's fingers flew across the keys so quickly they almost blurred, but not a single note was missed, not one. Her hands knew exactly where to go, as if they had a map of the keyboard burned into muscle memory. But technical perfection wasn't what made people's breath catch in their throats. It was the emotion. Every phrase, every passage sang with feeling. You could hear Beethoven's anger in the crashing chords, his fear in the trembling runs, his determination in the relentless rhythm that drove the piece forward. Lynn swayed slightly as she played, her body moving with the music. Her face reflected every shift in mood. During the gentle moments, her expression softened. During the violent passages, her jaw tightened, her brow furrowed. She wasn't performing for the audience. She was living inside the music, experiencing every emotion Beethoven had felt when he wrote it. Alexandra, the girl who had played first, sat with her mouth slightly open. She had studied this piece before and knew how difficult it was, but watching Lynn play it was like seeing it for the first time. This was what the piece was supposed to sound like. This was what it was supposed to feel like. Daniel stood at the back of the auditorium, having retreated there after his failed attempt. He watched Lynn with a mixture of awe and something that might have been shame. He had trained at the best schools in the world, had studied with masters, had access to the finest instruments and teachers. And yet this girl, who couldn't even see the keys, was playing circles around him. The music built to its climactic section, the part where Beethoven seemed to be shaking his fist at fate itself. Lynn's hands pounded the keys with controlled fury, each chord ringing out like a declaration of war. This wasn't about going deaf. This was about refusing to be defeated, about finding strength in the face of loss. People in the audience felt their hearts racing. Some had goosebumps on their arms. A few wiped at their eyes. This was why they loved music. This moment right here, when a performer stopped being just a person playing an instrument and became a channel for something deeper, something true. Victor uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward in his chair, his expression no longer neutral. His eyes were wide, intense. He had heard this piece performed by some of the greatest pianists alive. He had played it himself in concert halls around the world, but he had never heard it played quite like this. The final section approached, where the music had to transition from rage to something more complex, a mixture of acceptance and defiance. This was where most pianists struggled, where the emotion had to shift without losing momentum. Lynn handled it perfectly. Her playing softened just enough to show a glimmer of peace, but the underlying strength never wavered. Beethoven might have been losing his hearing, but he wasn't giving up. He was adapting, surviving, finding new ways to create beauty. Lynn's hands raced through the final passages, building to the conclusion. Her fingers were moving so fast now that it seemed impossible for any human to maintain such speed and accuracy. But she never faltered. Every note was clean, clear, perfectly articulated. The last chord rang out, powerful and final. Lynn held it, letting it resonate through the concert hall, letting it fade naturally into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire auditorium sat frozen as if waking from a dream. Lynn sat at the piano, her hands still on the keys, breathing hard from the physical and emotional effort of the performance. Then Victor stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood and began to clap. Slowly at first, then faster. The sound echoed in the silent hall. That broke the spell. The entire audience erupted. Everyone jumped to their feet, applauding thunderously. Some people were shouting brava. Others were simply clapping as hard as they could, smiling with pure joy. Lynn heard the applause and felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She hadn't cried when Victor dismissed her earlier. But now, overwhelmed by the response, she couldn't hold the emotions back. Her mother was sobbing in the back row, pride and relief washing over her. All those years of practice, all those times Lynn had come home from school upset because other kids didn't understand her. All those moments of doubt, they all led to this. To her daughter receiving a standing ovation from some of the most talented young musicians in the region, Victor walked over to the piano. The applause began to quiet as people realized he was about to speak. Lynn heard his footsteps approaching and turned toward the sound. "Stand up," Victor said gently. "Let them see you properly." Lynn stood facing the audience she couldn't see but could definitely hear. The applause swelled again. Victor stood beside her, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the hall. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. 12 years, Lynn answered, her voice still shaky with emotion. "And your teacher, Mrs. Wong at the community center in my town, she teaches piano to kids after school." Victor shook his head slowly, looking amazed. 12 years with a community center teacher and you play like this? How is that possible? Lynn thought about how to answer. Mrs. Wong always told me that my blindness could be an advantage if I let it. She said I couldn't be distracted by sheet music or by watching my hands or by looking at the audience. All I could do was listen and feel. So that's what I learned to do. I memorize everything by ear, and I try to feel what the composer felt when they wrote it. Victor turned to address the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we just witnessed was not simply a piano performance. That was truth. That was music in its purest form." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. "I have performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. I have heard the finest pianists of our generation. But today in this room, a 17-year-old girl taught me something I had forgotten. She reminded me what music is truly about." He turned back to Lynn. "I owe you an apology. Earlier today I dismissed you without giving you a chance. I saw your blindness and assumed it was a limitation. I was wrong. Your blindness isn't a disability. It's a gift that has made you see music more clearly than those of us who rely on our eyes." Lynn felt fresh tears coming. This was really happening. Victor Romano, her idol, was apologizing to her in front of everyone. "I have one request," Victor said. "Would you honor us with one more piece? Anything you'd like to play." Lynn didn't hesitate. "Clair de Lune," she said. "By Debussy," Victor smiled. "Perfect choice. Please, the piano is yours." Lynn sat back down at the bench, and as her fingers found the keys once more, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Clair de Lune meant moonlight in French, and that's exactly what Lynn's playing sounded like. Soft, gentle, like light filtering through clouds on a quiet night. The piece was completely different from the stormy passion of the Beethoven. This was peace. This was beauty in its simplest, most honest form. Her fingers moved delicately across the keys, each note floating into the air like a whisper. The melody was so tender it almost hurt to listen to. People in the audience felt themselves relaxing, their shoulders dropping, their breathing slowing. After the intensity of the previous performance, this was like a cool breeze on a hot day. Lynn smiled slightly as she played. This piece always made her happy. Mrs. Wong had taught it to her when she was 13 during a particularly hard time. Kids at school had been cruel that year, calling her names, excluding her from activities. The music had been her escape, her reminder that there was still beauty in the world. Debussy had written this piece to capture the feeling of moonlight on water, constantly shifting and shimmering. Lynn had never seen moonlight on water, but she understood it perfectly. She played the rippling passages with such fluidity that you could almost see the waves, almost feel the gentle movement of water under the moon. Victor stood at the side of the stage, not even pretending to maintain his professional distance anymore. He was completely absorbed in what he was hearing. This girl wasn't just talented. She was extraordinary, the kind of musician that appeared maybe once in a generation, if you were lucky. When the final notes faded away, the applause was different this time. It wasn't the explosive standing ovation of before. It was warmer, softer, but somehow even more genuine. People clapped with their hands over their hearts. Some were still wiping tears from their eyes. Lynn stood and gave a small bow. Victor approached her again and gently guided her to the front of the stage. "Thank you," he said simply. Then he turned to the audience. "I think we can all agree that this masterclass has taken an unexpected turn. We came here today expecting to discuss technique and interpretation. Instead, we received a masterclass in humility and truth." He paused, looking out at the young pianists in the audience. "How many of you have access to private teachers? Raise your hands." Almost every hand went up. "How many of you practice on expensive pianos at home or at prestigious music schools?" Most hands stayed up. "And how many of you," Victor continued, his voice growing stronger, "truly feel the music you play? How many of you connect with it the way this young woman does?" The hands slowly came down. Students looked at each other uncomfortably. They knew the answer, even if they didn't want to admit it. Victor walked back to Lynn. "Tell me about your practice routine. Where do you play?" "At the community center, mostly," Lynn said. "They have an old upright piano in one of the classrooms. I go there after school when it's available. Sometimes I have to wait if someone else is using the room. On weekends, Mrs. Wong lets me practice on her piano at her house." "An old upright piano," Victor repeated, shaking his head. "And you produce this level of artistry. It's humbling." He addressed the audience again. "I have spent my career focused on perfection. The perfect technique, the perfect interpretation, the perfect performance. I teach my students to analyze every measure, to plan every dynamic, to control every aspect of their playing. And these are important things to learn. But today, this young woman reminded me that there is something more important than perfection. There is honesty. There is emotion. There is truth." Lynn felt her face growing warm. She wasn't used to being the center of attention like this, especially not with praise. "I made a terrible mistake today," Victor continued. "When Lynn introduced herself to me earlier, I didn't give her a chance. I saw her white cane and made a judgment. I assumed she couldn't possibly play at the level required for this master class. I was so focused on what I thought she couldn't do that I didn't even consider what she might be capable of." The room was absolutely silent now. This wasn't just a famous pianist complimenting a student. This was something deeper. A confession. A moment of real vulnerability from someone who usually projected nothing but confidence and authority. "This is a lesson for all of us," Victor said, his voice softer now. "We live in a world that is so obsessed with credentials, with pedigree, with the right schools and the right teachers. And yes, these things have value, but they are not everything. Talent exists everywhere. Genius exists everywhere, sometimes in the most unexpected places, in people we might overlook if we're not paying attention." He turned to Lynn. "You have more natural musicality in your little finger than most pianists develop in a lifetime of study. Your teacher, Mrs. Wong at the community center, should be very proud. She has done something remarkable with you." "She's the best teacher I could ask for," Lynn said quietly. "She never treated me like I was different. She just taught me to love music. That is the mark of a true teacher," Victor said. "Not someone who simply transfers technique, but someone who opens hearts." A woman in the front row raised her hand. Victor nodded at her. "I'm from the Riverside School of Music," the woman said, standing up. "We're one of the top conservatory preparatory programs in the state. I would like to offer Lynn a full scholarship to study with us if she's interested." Before Lynn could respond, a man in the third row stood up. "I represent the National Youth Music Competition. Our next competition is in 3 months. We would be honored if Lynn would participate. Travel and accommodation would be fully covered." More people began standing, offering opportunities. A recording studio wanted to produce an album. A concert series wanted to feature her as a soloist. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell her story. Lynn felt overwhelmed. Her mother rushed down from the back row and wrapped her in a hug. "Baby, do you hear this? Do you hear what they're saying?" "I hear it," Lynn whispered. "I just can't believe it." Victor raised his hands, quieting the crowd. "Please, everyone, let's give Lynn and her family some space. I'm sure you all have business cards. You can leave your information with my assistant." He turned back to Lynn and her mother. "This is a lot to take in, I know. But these opportunities are real and they're well-deserved. You don't have to make any decisions today." "Thank you," Lynn's mother said, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you for giving her a chance. She gave herself the chance, Victor corrected gently. She was brave enough to raise her hand and volunteer. That took courage, especially after how I treated her earlier. He looked at Lynn thoughtfully. I want to make you an offer, but I don't want you to feel pressured. I would like to mentor you if you'd allow me, not as a formal teacher. That role belongs to Mrs. Wong. But as someone who can help guide your career, open doors, and occasionally offer advice. I think you have the potential to be one of the great pianists of your generation. Lynn couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face again. There is one condition, Victor said with a small smile. You must promise to stay true to yourself. Don't let anyone, including me, take away what makes your playing special. Don't lose that emotional honesty in pursuit of technical perfection. The world has plenty of technically perfect pianists. What it needs is artists who can touch people's hearts. I promise, Lynn managed to say. Victor shook her hand formally, then pulled her into a brief hug. You've changed my life today, he said quietly so only she and her mother could hear. Thank you for that gift. The masterclass officially ended shortly after, but people lingered, not wanting to leave. Students came up to congratulate Lynn, many of them genuinely happy for her, though a few looked envious. Parents took photos. Victor's assistant collected dozens of business cards from people wanting to work with Lynn. Through it all, Lynn held her mother's hand tightly, anchoring herself to what was real. Just this morning she had been a nobody, a blind girl from a small town who loved to play piano. Now she was someone people wanted to record, to feature, to study. It was terrifying and exciting all at once, but as long as her mother was beside her, as long as she remembered Mrs. Wong's lessons and Victor's advice to stay true to herself, she thought maybe, just maybe, she could handle whatever came next. 2 years passed like a dream that Lynn sometimes couldn't believe was real. The day after the masterclass, her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Music schools called with scholarship offers. Concert organizers invited her to perform. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. But through it all, Lynn kept her promise to Victor. She stayed true to herself. She continued studying with Mrs. Wong every week, even after accepting a place at the prestigious Riverside School of Music. Mrs. Wong cried when Lynn told her she still wanted her as her primary teacher. You don't need me anymore, Mrs. Wong had said. But Lynn disagreed. You taught me to love music, she said. I'll always need that. Victor became her mentor just as he'd promised. He called her once a month to check on her progress. He invited her to attend his concerts when he performed nearby. Most importantly, he taught her how to navigate the music world without losing herself in it. People will want to turn you into a story, he warned her early on. The blind girl who overcame adversity. They'll focus on your disability instead of your talent. Don't let them reduce you to a headline. You're a musician first. Everything else is secondary. Lynn took his advice to heart. In interviews, she talked about music, not about being blind. When people asked how she played without seeing, she gave simple answers and then redirected the conversation to the composers she loved or the pieces she was working on. Slowly, people started to understand. She wasn't interesting because she was blind. She was interesting because she was brilliant. Her first big performance came 6 months after the masterclass. A regional orchestra invited her to play as a featured soloist. The piece was Grieg's Piano Concerto, a challenging work that required coordination with dozens of other musicians. Lynn practiced until her fingers ached, memorizing not just her own part but the entire orchestral score so she would know exactly when to come in, when to hold back, when to soar above the ensemble. The night of the concert, she was so nervous she thought she might be sick. Her mother helped her into her concert dress, a simple but elegant black gown that Mrs. Wong had helped them pick out. You're going to be amazing, her mother whispered. Just like always. Walking onto that stage, hearing the applause of a full concert hall, Lynn felt her nerves transform into excitement. This was what she was meant to do. This was home. The performance was magical. The orchestra followed her lead, breathing with her, matching her passion and sensitivity. When she reached the final crashing chords of the concerto, the audience exploded into applause before the sound had even finished ringing through the hall. She took her bow, smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. Victor was in the audience that night. Afterward, he came backstage with flowers. You were transcendent, he said simply. I'm honored to know you. More opportunities followed. She performed at music festivals, competed in national competitions, gave recitals at universities. She didn't win every competition, and not every performance was perfect, but she learned from each experience, growing not just as a pianist but as a person. The biggest moment came on a cold evening in November, exactly 2 years after the masterclass. Lynn stood in the wings of Carnegie Hall in New York City, one of the most famous concert venues in the world. She was about to perform a solo recital on the same stage where legends had played. She thought back to that day in the masterclass, sitting in the back row, feeling worthless and dismissed. If someone had told her then that she'd be here now, she would never have believed them. Her mother stood beside her, holding her hand. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly. Lynn's father had passed away when she was 10, but she knew her mother was right. He had always believed in her, even when she doubted herself. "I'm ready," Lynn said. She walked onto the stage, guided by an assistant to the piano. The hall was completely full, over 2,000 people. She could hear them settling into their seats, programs rustling, whispers of anticipation. And there, in the front row, sat Victor. He had flown in from Europe just for this performance. Mrs. Wong sat beside him, looking slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur of the venue but beaming with pride. Lynn sat at the piano, a magnificent Steinway that had been played by countless masters before her. She took a breath, centered herself, and began her program with the piece that had changed her life, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, third movement. She played it even better than she had 2 years ago. Every note carried the weight of experience, of all the growth and learning and struggling she'd done since that day. The audience sat mesmerized, just as they had in that smaller concert hall so long ago. She continued with Chopin, Debussy, Rachmaninoff, and ended with a piece she had commissioned from a young composer, a work written specifically for her. It was modern and challenging, full of unexpected harmonies and rhythms. The composer had titled it Vision, and Lynn loved the irony of that. When the final note died away, the audience rose as one, applauding thunderously. Lynn stood and bowed, her heart full. This was it. This was the dream she hadn't even known she was allowed to have. The applause continued for so long that she had to play an encore. She chose Clair de Lune, the piece she'd played as her second offering at the masterclass. It felt like bringing everything full circle. After the concert, the reception was crowded with well-wishers. Record label executives wanted to talk about albums. Concert promoters pitched tours. But the moment that mattered most was when Victor approached her, his eyes glistening with tears. "Do you remember what I told you after you played at my masterclass?" he asked. "You said a lot of things," Lynn replied with a smile. "I said you had more musicality in your little finger than most pianists develop in a lifetime. I was wrong." Lynn's smile faltered slightly. "You have more musicality than most pianists could develop in 10 lifetimes," Victor continued. "What you did tonight, that wasn't just a concert. That was art in its purest form. You've become everything I hoped you would and more." Mrs. Wong joined them, pulling Lynn into a tight hug. "My girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My extraordinary girl." "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Lynn said. "Either of you. You both believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." "You did this," Victor corrected gently. "We just opened doors. You walked through them." Later, when the crowd had thinned and Lynn was finally alone with her mother in the dressing room, she let herself feel the full weight of what had happened, not just tonight, but everything that had led to this moment. "Do you ever think about that day?" her mother asked. "The masterclass?" "All the time," Lynn admitted. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't raised my hand. If I just stayed quiet in the back row." "But you didn't stay quiet," her mother said. "That's who you are. That's who you've always been. Brave enough to take risks. Strong enough to prove people wrong." Lynn thought about Victor, how he'd changed too. He had started advocating for disabled musicians, using his platform to push for more inclusion in classical music. He'd admitted in interviews that meeting Lynn had forced him to examine his own biases and assumptions. He'd become not just a better mentor, but a better person. Years later, when people asked Victor about the highlights of his career, he never talked about his own performances at Carnegie Hall or the awards he'd won. He always mentioned the masterclass where a blind girl taught him how to truly see. And Lynn, who had started that day feeling invisible and worthless, had become unforgettable. Not because of her disability, But despite people's obsession with it, she had proven that talent has no barriers, that music belongs to anyone who can feel it deeply enough to share it with the world. She kept Victor's advice close to her heart through all the years that followed. She stayed honest in her playing, never sacrificing emotion for technical perfection. She remained humble, remembering that community center with the old upright piano where her journey really began. But most importantly, she kept raising her hand, kept volunteering for challenges that scared her, kept proving that the only real limitations are the ones we accept for ourselves. And every time she sat down at a piano, whether in a concert hall or a practice room, she played like that 17-year-old girl who had something to prove. She played with her whole heart, holding nothing back, transforming notes on a page into truth that everyone could hear.